There's a quiet moment that almost no one talks about. It happens late at night. The house is finally still. Your phone screen lights up your face. And there it is again. Someone younger than you talking about money like it's easy. Like they cracked the code early. Like the door is already closing behind them. And for a second, a thought slips in. Did I wait too long? Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a small, heavy thought that sits in your chest. You don't feel lazy. You don't feel careless. You feel late. That feeling is dangerous. Most people think their 40s are the beginning of financial decline. A time for damage control, not progress. A time to be realistic. To lower expectations. To stop dreaming too loudly. But that story is wrong. Not a little wrong. Completely wrong. And the reason it feels so convincing has nothing to do with money. It has everything to do with comparison. In your 20s, you compare yourself to who you could become. In your 40s, you compare yourself to who you think you should already be. That difference changes everything. You start measuring your life against highlight reels instead of real timelines. You forget how long growth actually takes. You forget how much invisible progress you've already made just by living, working, surviving, and learning. Here's the truth most people never hear clearly enough. Your 40s are not the decade where your financial story ends. They're often the decade where it finally makes sense. Not because something magical happens. Not because you suddenly get lucky. But because something shifts inside you that wasn't there before. When you're younger, money feels abstract. When you're older, money feels real. You felt the stress of not having enough. You felt the regret of bad decisions. You felt the exhaustion of working hard without seeing progress. And while that can feel discouraging, it actually gives you something incredibly powerful. Clarity. Clarity about what doesn't work. Clarity about what matters. Clarity about what you're no longer willing to tolerate. Most people underestimate how valuable that is. They assume youth equals advantage. But youth often comes with confusion, impatience, and false confidence. Experience does something different. It strips away illusions. It teaches you that fast wins are fragile. That excitement fades quickly. That stability is underrated until you don't have it. And once you understand that, your behavior changes. Quietly, gradually, permanently. The problem is, no one frames your 40s this way. You're told this is the age where you should already have it together. Where mistakes mean you failed. Where starting now means you're behind forever. That message doesn't motivate people. It freezes them. They stop looking at their numbers because it hurts. They delay decisions because they're afraid of confirming their fears. They stay stuck because staying stuck feels safer than trying and feeling late again. But being late is only a problem if the race has already ended. It hasn't. What's actually happening is this. In your 40s, where patience isn't forced, it's learned. Where discipline isn't about willpower, it's about protecting your future peace. You don't need to win fast anymore. You need to win consistently. And consistency favors people who know themselves. People who've lived enough life to understand trade-offs. People who've been burned enough times to respect risk. People who don't need excitement to stay committed. That's not weakness. That's readiness. But readiness doesn't feel flashy. It feels quiet. It feels grounded. It feels boring compared to hype-filled success stories. And because of that, people miss it. They assume if it hasn't happened yet, it won't. They assume momentum only belongs to the young. They assume their best financial years are behind them. They're wrong. Not because everyone becomes wealthy later, but because the conditions for building real, lasting stability often don't exist until later. Think about it. You know yourself better now. You understand your spending patterns. You've seen consequences play out over years, not weeks. That awareness didn't come for free. You paid for it with time, stress, and experience. And yet, instead of seeing it as an asset, many people see it as proof they're too late. This video exists to gently but firmly challenge that belief. Not with pressure, not with hype, not with unrealistic promises, but with a calmer truth. The same decade you've been told to fear is often the decade where people finally stop sabotaging themselves. Where they stop chasing, where they stop proving, where they start building. Slowly, intentionally, quietly. If you've ever felt that sinking feeling that your financial window has already closed, stay with me. Because what you're feeling isn't failure, it's a transition. And once you understand what's really happening beneath that feeling, the story you've been telling yourself about your 40s begins to change. Not into something dramatic, into something possible. Let's talk about what life actually feels like in your 40s. Not the version people post online, the real one. Your days are full, but not always satisfying. You're busy, but somehow progress feels slow. Money comes in, money goes out. And at the end of the month, you're left wondering how someone who works this hard still feels behind. You don't feel reckless anymore. You don't impulse spend like you used to. You don't chase every shiny idea. And yet, something still feels off. You open your bank app and pause before scrolling. Not because the numbers are terrible, but because they're confusing. They don't reflect the effort you've put in over the years. They don't tell a story that matches how responsible you feel now. You think back to your 20s and early 30s. Back then, you didn't worry this much. Not because things were better, but because consequences felt far away. You could brush off mistakes. You could tell yourself there was time to fix everything later. Now, time feels louder. You notice it when birthdays pass faster. You notice it when your energy doesn't bounce back as quickly. You notice it when financial decisions feel heavier than they used to. A purchase isn't just a purchase anymore. It's a trade-off. You think about responsibilities, people who depend on you, future versions of yourself who will have to live with today's choices. That awareness is exhausting. So you do what many reasonable people do. You postpone. You tell yourself you'll look at your finances when things calm down, when work is less stressful, when life gives you breathing room. But life rarely does. There's always something. A bill, a repair, an unexpected expense, a reason to wait. And slowly, waiting becomes a habit. Not because you don't care, but because caring feels overwhelming. You might recognize this pattern. You start a plan with good intentions. You track your spending for a week or two. You tell yourself this time will be different. Then something interrupts the routine. A long day, a family issue, a moment of fatigue, and the plan quietly fades. Not in a dramatic failure, just a gentle drift back to old patterns. This creates a specific kind of frustration that's hard to explain. You know more than you used to. You're more disciplined than before. But the gap between knowing and doing still exists. And that gap feels personal. You start asking yourself questions you never had to face before. Why haven't I figured this out by now? Am I bad with money? Did I miss my chance to get ahead? Those questions don't come from logic. They come from comparison. You see stories of people who seem to have everything aligned. They started early. They invested consistently. They made all the right moves. And even if you know those stories are incomplete, they still sting. Because your story feels messy. You've had starts and stops. You've made progress, then slipped back. You've done some things right and many things late. And late feels unforgivable in a world obsessed with early success. So instead of feeling motivated, you feel pressure. Pressure to catch up fast. Pressure to fix everything at once. Pressure to make one perfect move that erases years of uncertainty. That pressure often leads to the wrong behavior. You either freeze completely or you swing too hard. You consider drastic changes. You look for shortcuts. You're tempted by ideas that promise to make up for lost time quickly. And when those ideas don't feel safe, you retreat again. This back and forth creates mental noise. You think about money more than you ever did before, yet you feel less clear. You want stability, but every decision feels loaded with risk. Even saving feels complicated. You save, then dip into it. You build something, then life knocks it down. You start questioning whether consistency is even possible anymore. And underneath all of this is a quiet fear you rarely say out loud. What if this is as good as it gets? That fear isn't about luxury. It's about security. It's about wondering whether the future version of you will feel relieved or resentful. Whether you're setting yourself up for peace or constant stress. You don't want to be rich. You want to breathe. You want choices. You want margin. You want to stop feeling like one unexpected event could undo everything, but the advice you hear doesn't help. It's either too simple to feel realistic or too complex to feel doable. It's framed for people who are just starting or people who already won. You feel stuck in between. Too experienced to believe in fantasies. Too uncertain to trust yourself fully. And because of that, you may start telling yourself a story. That window has passed. If I didn't do it earlier, it won't work now. I should just focus on getting by. That story feels protective. It lowers expectations. It reduces disappointment. But it also quietly shrinks your future. Not because it's true, but because it changes how you behave. When you believe it's too late, you stop planting seeds. When you believe progress won't matter, you stop being consistent. When you believe effort won't pay off, you conserve energy instead of investing it. This is the real problem most people face in their 40s. Not lack of income, not lack of intelligence, not lack of opportunity. It's the emotional weight of feeling behind. That weight clouds judgment. It distorts time. It makes reasonable steps feel pointless. Before anything practical can change, this needs to be understood. Because the feeling of being late is powerful, but it's also misleading. And until you see why that feeling exists in the first place, every financial decision will feel heavier than it needs to be. That's what we're going to unpack next. The feeling that you're late doesn't come from math. It comes from the way your brain interprets time, regret, and comparison. To understand this, you have to step away from money for a moment and look at how humans actually process their lives. Your brain is not designed to measure progress objectively. It's designed to protect you from pain. When you look back at your 20s, your mind doesn't remember confusion, insecurity, or the long stretches of not knowing what you were doing. It remembers potential, possibility, open doors. So when you compare that memory to your present, the contrast feels harsh. Back then, everything felt ahead of you. Now everything feels like it should already be in place. This creates a psychological illusion. You don't feel older because time passed. You feel older because the number of remaining redos feels smaller. That's not reality. That's perception. Your brain does something else that makes this worse. It compresses the past and stretches the future. 10 years ago feels like it flew by. 10 years ahead feels heavy and slow. So when someone says, just be consistent for the next 20 years, your emotional reaction isn't hope. It's fatigue. Your mind whispers, that's too long. But here's the trick. The past always feels shorter than it was because you're not living it anymore. The future feels longer because you haven't lived it yet. This makes starting now feel less powerful than it actually is. There's also the issue of identity. In your 40s, you don't see yourself as becoming anymore. You see yourself as being. That subtle shift matters. When you're younger, mistakes feel like experiments. When you're older, mistakes feel like verdicts. So every financial decision carries more emotional weight. You're not just choosing what to do, you're choosing what kind of person you believe you are. That's why avoidance becomes tempting. If you don't look closely, you don't have to label yourself. If you don't commit, you don't have to risk being wrong. This isn't laziness, it's self-protection. Your brain is trying to shield your identity from disappointment. Another psychological force at play is something rarely talked about: accumulated regret. Regret isn't just about what you did wrong. It's about what you didn't do consistently. Skipped habits, delayed decisions, good intentions that never turned into action. Each one on its own feels small, but over decades, they stack quietly. By your 40s, you're not just dealing with today's choices. You're carrying the emotional residue of years of "I'll start later." That residue creates pressure, and pressure narrows thinking. When people feel behind, they don't make patient decisions. They look for relief. Relief from the discomfort of waiting. Relief from the feeling of being stuck. Relief from the story they're telling themselves. That's why catch-up thinking is so dangerous. It convinces you that speed matters more than stability. Instead of asking, what can I sustain? You ask, what can fix this fast? But your brain wasn't built for long-term systems. It was built for immediate safety. There's also something else happening that's uniquely strong in your 40s. You've lived long enough to see how unpredictable life is. You've seen plans fall apart. You've watched people do everything right and still struggle. You've experienced moments where effort didn't equal outcome. That realism is healthy, but it has a shadow side. It can turn into quiet cynicism. You start believing that planning doesn't matter as much as people claim. That luck plays a bigger role than anyone admits. That maybe you just didn't get the right timing, so part of you holds back. If nothing is guaranteed, why fully commit? This belief feels mature, but it can slowly drain momentum. The truth sits in the middle. Life is unpredictable, yes, but patterns still matter. Your brain struggles to hold both truths at once, so it defaults to the one that reduces emotional effort. And finally, there's the comparison trap. You are not comparing yourself to average people. You're comparing yourself to extremes. People who started early and stuck with it. People who talk publicly about money wins. People whose stories survived long enough to be visible. You're comparing your private, messy reality to curated narratives. Your brain doesn't correct for that bias. It internalizes it, and once it does, every normal financial step feels inadequate. Saving feels too small. Consistency feels too slow. Patience feels pointless. This is how people end up doing nothing while feeling guilty about it. Not because they don't care, but because the emotional load becomes heavier than the action itself. Understanding this matters because it reframes your situation. You're not late because you failed. You feel late because your brain is interpreting time, identity, and comparison in a distorted way. Once you see that, something shifts. The urgency softens, the pressure loosens, and space opens up for a different kind of thinking. Thinking that's calmer, thinking that's steadier, thinking that actually leads to progress. But before we talk about what to do differently, there's one more piece you need to see. The cost of staying in this mental loop isn't just emotional, it's quietly expensive. When people think about financial mistakes, they imagine dramatic moments. A bad purchase, a risky decision, a clear misstep you can point to and regret. They look like waiting. They look like telling yourself, I'll deal with this when things calm down. They look like staying roughly where you are because nothing feels urgent enough to change. This is the invisible cost. At first, waiting feels harmless, even responsible. You're not making reckless moves. You're not risking what you've built. You're being cautious. But caution has a shadow. This is the invisible cost. Over time, caution quietly turns into inertia. And inertia has consequences that don't announce themselves. They show up slowly. You don't notice them month to month. You notice them decade to decade. 1 year of I'll start soon doesn't matter much. 5 years begins to shape your future. 10 years quietly locks it in. The cost isn't just financial. It's psychological. Every year you delay, your confidence erodes a little. Not because you're incapable, but because trust in yourself is built through follow-through. When plans keep getting postponed, you start believing you're the kind of person who doesn't stick to things. That belief affects behavior. You hesitate more. You doubt small decisions. You overthink simple steps. Eventually, even reasonable actions feel heavy. There's also the cost of missed compounding, but not in the way it's usually explained. People talk about compounding like it's only about money growing, but behavior compounds too. When you build small, consistent habits, they reinforce identity. You start seeing yourself as someone who follows through, someone who plans ahead, someone who can be trusted with long-term goals. When you delay, the opposite compounds. Avoidance becomes familiar, discomfort feels normal. The gap between intention and action widens. That gap is exhausting. It creates a low-level stress that never fully goes away. You're not panicked, you're just uneasy. Options don't disappear suddenly. They narrow quietly, a little less flexibility each year. A few fewer choices. More decisions made for you by circumstances instead of intention. You feel this when expenses feel less negotiable, when obligations feel heavier, when the future starts feeling more fixed than flexible. None of this happens because you're bad with money. It happens because time rewards movement, not perfection. There's also a cost to constantly feeling behind. You start seeing it as something to manage stress rather than something to build stability. You spend to feel relief. You avoid planning to avoid discomfort. Even saving can feel like deprivation instead of progress. So the emotional relationship with money becomes strained, and strained relationships don't improve without attention. The final invisible cost is this: when you wait too long, you lose the chance to learn through small mistakes. You either do nothing or you feel pressure to get everything right at once. That pressure makes learning harder. It pushes you toward extremes, either overly conservative behavior that keeps you stuck, or overly aggressive behavior that tries to compensate for lost time. Both are reactions to fear, not clarity. This is why the idea that starting later means it's not worth starting is so damaging. It doesn't just delay growth, it reshapes identity. It trains you to believe effort won't matter enough to justify discomfort.
And once that belief settles in, progress becomes unlikely even when opportunities are right in front of you. But here's the quiet truth. Nothing dramatic needs to change for this trajectory to shift. No overhaul, no sudden leap, no perfect plan. What's required is not intensity. It's a turning point, a moment where the story in your head changes just enough to allow movement again. That turning point doesn't come from pressure. It comes from perspective. And once it happens, the weight you've been carrying begins to feel lighter. Not because the path is easy, but because it's clear. That's what we're moving toward next. The turning point doesn't arrive as motivation. It doesn't feel exciting. It doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't come with certainty. It arrives quietly as a realization, a simple thought that changes how you see yourself. It sounds like this: I'm not late. I'm finally ready. This is the moment where the pressure eases just enough for clarity to enter. Because the truth is, most people don't fail financially because they lack time. They struggle because they act before they're emotionally prepared to be consistent. In your earlier years, you had energy but not patience, information but not judgment, optimism but not discipline. Now, those pieces have shifted. You don't need convincing that stability matters. You don't need excitement to take action. You don't need proof that small habits add up. You already know these things in your bones. The turning point is when you stop seeing your past as evidence against you and start seeing it as training. All those years weren't wasted. They taught you what stress feels like. They taught you what financial anxiety costs. They taught you which shortcuts aren't worth it. That knowledge doesn't show up on a balance sheet, but it changes behavior. And behavior is where outcomes are born. This is also the moment where your timeline changes. You stop asking, "Why didn't I start earlier?" and start asking, "What can I build from here?" That question is powerful because it points forward. It doesn't deny the past. It just stops arguing with it. You realize something else too. You no longer need to prove anything. Not to friends, not to family, not to your younger self. You're not trying to win a race. You're trying to build a life that feels steady. That shift removes urgency. And when urgency fades, better decisions become possible. You start thinking in systems instead of outcomes. Instead of, "How much will this make me?" you ask, "Can I live with this choice for years?" Instead of, "Is this the best move?" you ask, "Is this a reasonable move I'll actually stick with?" This is maturity showing up in action. It's not flashy, but it's effective. Another part of the turning point is accepting a quieter truth. You don't need to catch up to anyone. The idea of catching up assumes there's a universal timeline. There isn't. There are only trade-offs, seasons, and starting points. Some people started early but burned out. Some people moved fast and then reversed. Some people built slowly and steadily without ever talking about it. You only see the loud stories, but wealth, stability, and peace are usually built quietly. Once you accept this, comparison loses its grip. You still notice other people, but their progress no longer defines yours. That emotional freedom is not small. It creates mental space, and mental space is what allows consistency to grow. This is also where responsibility stops feeling heavy. Before, responsibility felt like pressure. Now it feels like ownership. You're no longer reacting to where you think you should be. You're responding to where you actually are. That difference matters, because realistic starting points lead to realistic plans, and realistic plans are the ones that survive real life. This turning point doesn't mean everything feels easy. You'll still have doubts. You'll still feel moments of frustration. You'll still wish you'd done some things differently. But those thoughts no longer control your actions. They pass through without stopping you. That's the shift. Not from fear to confidence, but from fear to movement. You stop waiting to feel ready. You act because readiness has already arrived in a quieter form. The next step is not about fixing everything. It's about building a simple framework that works with who you are now, not who you used to be or who you wish you were. Something you can repeat, something you can understand, something that fits your life. That's where real progress begins.